In the winter of 1806, a 23-year-old businessman from Boston stood on the edge of a frozen pond in Massachusetts and had what most people around him considered a completely insane idea. He wanted to cut the ice off that pond, pack it into ships, and sell it to people living in the Caribbean. Not silver. Not spices. Not silk. Ice. His name was Frederic Tudor. And the men he pitched this idea to laughed at him. Newspapers mocked him. His own brother refused to get involved. One Boston merchant wrote in his diary that the scheme was, quote, so wild and visionary that no one will engage in it. Here is what makes that reaction interesting. Within 50 years, Frederic Tudor would be worth the equivalent of hundreds of millions of dollars. The industry he created would employ tens of thousands of workers across the United States. Ice would be shipped to India, China, Australia, South America, and across the Caribbean. Cities would redesign themselves around it. Doctors would prescribe it. Brewers would depend on it. Entire categories of food that you eat today would not exist without it. And then, in the span of a single generation, the entire natural ice industry would collapse, replaced by a machine that could manufacture cold from nothing. That story, from frozen pond to global commodity to mechanical revolution, changed what humans eat, how they store food, how cities are built, and what it means to live a comfortable life. And it started long before Frederic Tudor ever laced up his boots and walked out onto that Massachusetts pond. So how did something that falls from the sky for free become one of the most valuable commodities in the 19th century? How did ice reshape global trade, revolutionize agriculture, transform medicine, and permanently alter the human diet? How did it go from a luxury enjoyed only by emperors and kings to something so ordinary that you fill your glass with it without a second thought? This is the history of ice. And almost none of it is what you expect. The story of humans harvesting and using ice is far older than Frederic Tudor. Far older than America. Far older than any of the civilizations most people learned about in school. The earliest known ice storage structures date back to around 1700 BC in Mesopotamia, in the region that is now modern Iraq and Syria. Ancient texts from the Kingdom of Mari reference the construction of icehouses, insulated underground chambers where snow and ice collected during winter could be stored for use during summer months. Think about that for a moment. Nearly 4,000 years ago, in a region of the world we do not typically associate with cold or ice, rulers were building sophisticated storage systems specifically designed to preserve cold through the summer heat. Why? Because cold was power. In ancient Mesopotamia, having access to chilled drinks and cold food during summer was a privilege of royalty and nobility. The effort required to collect, transport, and store ice was enormous. Entire teams of workers were needed to carry snow down from mountains or harvest ice from frozen rivers before it melted. Then that ice had to be packed into insulated underground chambers, typically sealed with straw, sawdust, or animal skins and guarded. Alexander the Great reportedly chilled his wine with snow packed into specially dug pits near his military camps. Nero, the Roman emperor, had runners carry snow down from the Apennine Mountains into Rome where it was mixed with fruit and honey. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder documented both the practice and his concern about it, arguing that drinking cold beverages was unhealthy, a position that physicians would debate for the next 2,000 years. In ancient China, the Zhou dynasty maintained official government positions specifically dedicated to ice collection and storage. The Zhouli, a text describing the rituals and offices of the Zhou court, mentions the Lingyin, literally the Iceman, an official whose entire role was managing the royal ice supply. Archaeological evidence shows that by 1100 BC, the Zhou kings were using underground ice cellars to store food and chill ceremonial drinks. In ancient Persia, engineers constructed remarkable structures called yakshals, literally meaning ice pit in Persian. These were large domed buildings, sometimes reaching 60 feet in height, built with a specific combination of thick walls, underground chambers, and an insulating mortar made from sand, clay, egg whites, and ash. Wind catchers on the roof drew cool air down into the structure. Channels called canets brought cold winter water into the storage area. These were not primitive holes in the ground. They were sophisticated thermodynamic systems designed and built by engineers who understood heat flow without having the language to describe it scientifically. Some of these yakshal structures still stand today in Iran. Meanwhile, in the Islamic world, sherbet, the ancestor of modern sorbet and ice cream, was being chilled with mountain snow and sold in the markets of Cairo, Baghdad, and Damascus. The Arab physician Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, wrote about the medical use of cold water and ice in the 11th century, recommending it for reducing fever and treating inflammation. In every civilization where ice could be obtained, the pattern was the same. Ice was medicine. Ice was luxury. Ice was power. But for thousands of years, ice remained fundamentally limited. You could only have it if you lived near mountains that held snow year-round or in climates cold enough to freeze rivers and lakes in winter. You could store it, but only imperfectly and expensively. You could move it, but only short distances before it melted away. The idea that ice could be a traded commodity, something harvested in bulk in one location and shipped to places that had never seen a frozen pond, that idea had never occurred to anyone. Until Frederic Tudor. Frederic Tudor was born in 1783 into a wealthy Boston family. He was not a scientist or an engineer. He was a merchant who was very good at refusing to accept that something was impossible. In the winter of 1805, Tudor and his brother William were sitting at the family's estate in Saugus, Massachusetts. It was cold. The ponds were frozen solid. William made an offhand observation that it would be remarkable if they could ship this ice to the tropics where people sweltered in summer heat and had never experienced a cold drink. William said it as a joke. Frederic wrote it down as a business plan. The first shipment left Boston for Martinique in the Caribbean in February 1806. Tudor had 130 tons of ice cut from the family's pond, packed into an insulated wooden shiphold, and sailed south. He had not thought to arrange a storage facility on the other end. He had not secured buyers in advance. He arrived in Martinique with a ship full of ice and no plan for selling it. By the time he organized buyers, a significant portion had melted. He lost everything on that first voyage. He came home and immediately started planning the second shipment. This is the part of the Tudor story that history books tend to gloss over. He failed spectacularly and repeatedly for years. He was thrown into debtor's prison at least twice. His creditors chased him across New England. Newspapers continued to mock him. He was by any reasonable measure a financial disaster. But he was also learning something that would eventually make him extraordinarily wealthy. The problem with the ice trade was not the ice. Ice could be kept cold for much longer than people assumed, as long as it was properly insulated. Tudor ran meticulous experiments, testing different insulating materials, sawdust, rice straw, wood shavings, and discovered that sawdust was remarkably effective. He learned that if blocks of ice were cut to uniform size, they stacked more tightly, reducing the surface area exposed to warm air. He learned that a well-insulated icehouse in a hot climate could preserve ice with losses of only 8% over many months. He also learned something about human psychology that turned out to be just as important as the thermodynamics. People in warm climates did not want ice because they had never experienced it. They had no reference point. They did not know what they were missing. Tudor's solution was almost absurdly simple. He gave ice away for free. He persuaded tavern owners and restaurant operators in Havana, Calcutta, and New Orleans to accept free ice. He sent detailed instructions on how to use it to keep drinks cold and make ice cream. He let people experience cold drinks in tropical heat for the first time in their lives. Then he stopped giving it away. The demand he had created was immediate and desperate. People who had never had cold drinks suddenly could not imagine living without them. Tudor had not just created a supply, he had manufactured a need that had not previously existed. By the 1820s, the Tudor Ice Company was profitable. By the 1830s, it was dominant. By the 1840s, Frederic Tudor was known as the Ice King of the world, and Boston's ice trade was one of the largest commodity businesses in America. But Tudor alone could not have built an industry. He needed someone to solve the harvest problem, the slow, dangerous, unpredictable process of cutting ice from frozen ponds by hand. That someone was Nathaniel Wyeth. Nathaniel Wyeth was Tudor's icehouse superintendent, a practical man who solved problems with tools rather than with grand visions. In 1825, he invented the horse-drawn ice plow. Before Wyeth's invention, ice was cut from frozen ponds and lakes using handsaws. It was slow, inconsistent, and exhausting work. The cuts were irregular, the blocks were uneven, and the whole process was limited by how many men with saws you could fit on a pond. Wyeth's ice plow was a wooden frame fitted with iron teeth, pulled by a horse across the frozen surface of a pond. The teeth scored the ice in parallel lines. Then workers went over the same lines again at a 90-degree angle, creating a grid. The result was a field of perfectly uniform ice blocks, each one the same size, ready to be broken apart with chisels and floated down channels to waiting icehouses. This single invention transformed ice harvesting from artisanal labor into industrial production. With Wyeth's plow, a team of workers could harvest in one day what previously took a week. The uniformity of the blocks meant they packed more efficiently, melted more slowly, and could be stacked and stored with mechanical precision. Tudor adopted the technology immediately. Other ice merchants copied it within years. By the 1840s, ice harvesting operations on ponds throughout New England, Walden Pond among them, much to Henry David Thoreau's considerable annoyance, employed thousands of workers during winter months. Teams of horses, workers with plows and chisels and ice hooks, canal systems connecting ponds to ice houses connected to shipping docks. It was an industrial operation that ran with the efficiency of a factory, constrained only by weather that winter was cold enough to freeze the ponds to the required thickness. That constraint would eventually become the industry's fatal weakness. But before that happened, the ice trade grew into something that reshaped the world. Here is where the story of ice becomes something more than the biography of a Boston merchant. Because the ice trade did not just sell a product. It fundamentally rewired the relationship between humans and food. Before mechanical refrigeration, the geography of food was simple and brutal. You ate what grew near you, in the season it grew. Meat was eaten fresh immediately after slaughter or heavily salted, smoked, or dried to prevent spoilage. Fish further than a day's travel from the coast was almost always pickled or dried. Dairy was consumed within hours of production or converted into butter and cheese, which could last longer. Fruits and vegetables were seasonal in an absolute sense. When they were gone until next year. This was not a lifestyle choice. This was the physical reality of a world without cold storage. Ice broke that reality open. The American beef industry as it exists today, cattle ranches in the West, slaughterhouses in Chicago, fresh beef sold in shops across the country, would have been structurally impossible without ice. In the 1870s, a businessman named Gustavus Swift had the idea of slaughtering cattle in Chicago and shipping the dressed beef east by rail rather than shipping live animals. The problem was obvious. Dressed beef spoils in days. A live steer can walk onto a train in Kansas City and arrive alive in New York. A dressed carcass cannot. Swift's solution was the refrigerated railcar packed with ice. Working with engineer Andrew Chase, Swift designed a car with ice bunkers at each end, air circulation channels that kept the interior near freezing throughout the journey, and insulated walls that held the cold. The first refrigerated railcar full of dressed beef made the journey from Chicago to Boston in 1878. The economics were transformative. Shipping live cattle was expensive and wasteful. A significant portion of a live animal's weight is bone, hide, and organs that most consumers did not want. Shipping dressed beef was far more efficient. Swift could process waste products into byproducts, lard, soap, glue, fertilizer, at the slaughterhouse rather than paying to ship them across the country. His costs dropped dramatically. His prices undercut local butchers. Within a decade, the entire American meat industry had reorganized around refrigerated railcars and ice-packed storage. The big four meatpacking companies, Swift, Armour, Morris, and Hammond, became some of the most powerful corporations in the United States. The American diet shifted permanently toward more beef consumption as prices fell and availability increased. And every refrigerated railcar on every mile of those journeys depended on ice. Before ice, fresh fish was a privilege of coastal living. If you lived in Kansas or Iowa in 1840, you ate salted fish or no fish at all. Fresh fish was simply not available. Ice changed that completely. Fishing fleets began packing their catches in ice directly on the boat, dramatically extending the usable life of the catch. Ice-packed fish could survive rail journeys of hundreds or even thousands of miles and arrive in landlocked cities still fresh enough to sell. Entire new markets opened for fishing industries that had previously been limited by geography. The lobster industry in Maine is a perfect example. Before refrigerated shipping, lobsters were so abundant and so difficult to transport that they were considered trash food, fed to prisoners, used as fertilizer, sold to the very poor. Ice and refrigerated transport turned them into a luxury product. As the ability to ship them fresh improved, demand from wealthy consumers in distant cities drove prices up. Within a few decades, lobster went from poverty food to fine dining. This pattern repeated itself across dozens of species and dozens of markets. Ice did not just preserve food. It redistributed the entire geography of what was available where. Of all the food categories transformed by ice, perhaps none was more dramatically affected than dairy. Fresh milk in the pre-refrigeration era was an extraordinarily dangerous product. In summer months, raw milk could spoil within hours of leaving the cow. The bacteria that caused the spoilage and the resulting diseases, including tuberculosis, typhoid fever, and scarlet fever, killed thousands of people annually, particularly children. Milk was simultaneously a staple food and a significant public health hazard. Ice extended the useful life of fresh milk dramatically. Dairy farmers began packing milk cans in ice for transport to cities. Ice-cooled storage at dairies and in shops reduced bacterial growth and spoilage rates. For the first time, fresh milk could be produced in rural areas and delivered reliably to urban consumers. This triggered an explosion in the dairy industry. Cows that had previously supplied local farms and local markets could now supply entire cities. Specialized dairy farms emerged, focused entirely on milk production rather than diversified agriculture. Milk delivery routes, the morning milk delivery to the doorstep that persisted well into the 20th century in many countries, were only possible because of ice cooling systems. The milk industry also illustrates the public health dimension of ice's impact. When cities invested in reliable ice supplies and cold storage for dairy products, childhood mortality rates from milk-borne illness dropped significantly. Ice was not just a luxury product. In the context of 19th century urban life, it was a life-saving public health technology. If you are finding this fascinating, hit subscribe right now. Every day we cover stories like this one, the hidden histories of ordinary things that shape the entire world. You will not want to miss what is coming next. Before the ice trade, ice cream was exclusively a food of the wealthy. It required cream, sugar, flavorings, and most critically, ice. In a world where ice was rare and expensive, ice cream was a dessert served at presidential banquets and aristocratic dinners. Dolly Madison famously served strawberry ice cream at President Madison's inaugural banquet in 1813. George Washington reportedly spent the modern equivalent of thousands of dollars on ice cream in a single summer at Mount Vernon. These were not men spending lavishly on an accessible pleasure, they were paying the enormous cost of having ice delivered to their homes in sufficient quantity to freeze cream. The ice trade made ice affordable for the first time. By the 1840s and 1850s, street vendors in New York and Philadelphia were selling penny licks, small glasses of ice cream sold for a penny on street corners. Ice cream became accessible to working-class consumers for the first time in history. The ice cream cone itself, invented at the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis, emerged from the convergence of affordable ice cream and inventive street vendors. By the early 20th century, ice cream was one of the most popular foods in America across all social classes. A luxury of kings had become an everyday pleasure of ordinary people. That transformation was only possible because of industrial ice. By the 1850s, the American ice trade had gone global in a way that still seems almost inconceivable. Ice cut from frozen ponds in Massachusetts was being shipped to Calcutta, India, a journey of more than 16,000 miles around the southern tip of Africa. The ships took between 4 and 6 months to make the voyage. Losses to melting were significant, sometimes 50% or more of the original cargo. And yet the trade was profitable enough to sustain regular shipments for decades. The story of ice in India illustrates the extraordinary reach of the American ice trade. When Tudor first shipped ice to Calcutta in 1833, the British colonial population in India was living in tropical heat with no access to cold drinks or cold food preservation. The arrival of reliable ice supplies transformed colonial life. British merchants, officials, and soldiers in India could for the first time have cold drinks, chilled food storage, and ice-packed medical supplies. Indian consumers also developed a taste for ice, particularly for ice-chilled water and cold drinks. A domestic Indian ice trade developed in the cooler northern regions, harvesting ice from the Himalayas and distributing it south. But for the warmer coastal cities, American ice remained the only viable source until mechanical refrigeration arrived. In Australia, the pattern was similar. American ice ships reached Sydney in the 1850s and 1860s. In South America, ice from New England supplied ports from Rio de Janeiro to Buenos Aires. In the Caribbean, cities like Havana and Kingston had grown so dependent on American ice that shortages during winter thaws, when ponds failed to freeze to sufficient depth, caused genuine economic disruption. The American ice trade had created, for the first time in history, a genuinely global cold chain. But it had also created a system of extraordinary fragility. The ice trade had a problem that grew worse every decade. And it was a problem built into the very nature of natural ice. Ice cut from ponds and lakes did not come from sterile, isolated sources. It came from waterways that were also used by farms, factories, and cities. As American industrialization accelerated through the second half of the 19th century, rivers and ponds became increasingly polluted. Mill effluent, agricultural runoff, and in many cases raw sewage contaminated the same water sources from which ice merchants harvested their product. The consequences were predictable and alarming. In the 1880s and 1890s, multiple typhoid fever outbreaks were traced to contaminated natural ice. In Chicago, Milwaukee, and several New England cities, the use of polluted lake or river ice in food and drink was identified as a transmission route for waterborne disease. Ice, which had been promoted as a public health tool for preserving safe food and drink, was itself becoming a vector for illness. Public concern about ice purity grew rapidly. Ice merchants responded by moving harvest operations to more remote, cleaner water sources, but this increased transportation costs significantly. Some entrepreneurs began testing and certifying their ice, marketing premium clean ice at higher prices. But the fundamental problem remained. Natural ice was an agricultural product, dependent on uncontrollable environmental conditions, harvested from water sources that humans could not fully control or protect from contamination. The industry needed a different solution. And that solution was already being invented. The idea of creating cold mechanically, without ice, had been pursued by scientists and inventors since the early 19th century. In 1748, a Scottish physician named William Cullen demonstrated that rapidly evaporating a liquid in a vacuum could create cooling. He did not develop this observation into a practical machine, but he established the thermodynamic principle that all mechanical refrigeration depends on: evaporation absorbs heat from its surroundings. In 1805, an American inventor named Oliver Evans designed a vapor compression refrigeration machine, the basic principle behind every modern refrigerator and air conditioner. Evans never built his machine, but he described it in enough detail that later inventors could build on his concept. In 1834, Jacob Perkins, an American engineer working in London, actually built and patented a working vapor compression refrigeration machine. It worked. It could create ice mechanically. But it was large, expensive, and mechanically unreliable. Nobody invested in scaling it. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. In the 1840s and 1850s, American doctors working in the South and in tropical climates were growing increasingly desperate for reliable ice supplies for medical use. During disease outbreaks, yellow fever epidemics were devastating cities like New Orleans regularly. Ice was used to reduce fevers and preserve medical supplies. When natural ice shipments were delayed or insufficient, people died. Dr. John Gorey, a physician in Apalachicola, Florida, built a mechanical ice-making machine in 1844 primarily to help his yellow fever patients. He received the first American patent for a mechanical refrigeration machine in 1851. Gorey envisioned his machine as a medical device and a humanitarian technology. He died in 1855, broke and largely ignored, never knowing that his fundamental design would eventually replace the entire natural ice industry. The first commercially successful mechanical ice plant opened in New Orleans in 1866. By the 1870s, mechanical ice plants were operating in most major American cities. By the 1880s, they were operating in Australia, India, Britain, and Europe. The machines produced ice that was cleaner, more consistent, and increasingly cheaper than natural ice, and they could operate year-round regardless of weather. The natural ice industry fought back. Tudor's successors marketed natural ice as purer, more natural, and healthier than machine-made ice. They lobbied against mechanical ice plants. They published pamphlets questioning the safety of artificially produced ice. None of it worked. By 1900, mechanical ice production was dominant in most major markets. By 1930, the natural ice industry that Frederic Tudor had spent his life building had effectively ceased to exist. The ice machine did not just replace natural ice. It made ice genuinely abundant for the first time. When the cost of producing ice dropped to near zero and the supply became unlimited and year-round, ice transformed from a seasonal commodity into a permanent infrastructure. For most of the 19th century, ice entered homes and businesses through a device called the Icebox, an insulated wooden cabinet with a compartment for a block of ice and a lower compartment where food was kept cool by the cold air that sank from the melting ice above. The Icebox was a remarkable piece of technology in its time. It allowed households to keep food for days rather than hours. Leftovers became viable. Shopping trips that had previously needed to happen daily could be stretched to every few days. Perishable foods that could not have been kept in a non-refrigerated kitchen, fresh meat, dairy, prepared foods, became regular parts of the household routine. The Iceman cometh. This phrase became embedded in American culture because the arrival of the Iceman delivering blocks to homes was a ritual of daily life in American cities from roughly the 1870s through the 1930s. Children knew the Iceman by name. Housewives placed cards in windows indicating how many pounds of ice they needed. Urban neighborhoods organized themselves partly around ice delivery routes. But the Icebox had a fundamental problem. It required constant servicing. The ice melted. The drip pan underneath needed emptying. Fresh ice needed delivering every few days. The temperature inside varied depending on how much ice remained and how often the door was opened. It was better than nothing, but it was far from convenient. The electric refrigerator changed everything. The first household electric refrigerators appeared in the early 1910s. The Demelra domestic electric refrigerator reached American homes in 1913. The Frigidaire, introduced by General Motors in 1918, brought the technology to mass-market scale. By the 1920s and 1930s, electric refrigerators were dropping in price rapidly. By 1944, 85% of American households with electricity had a refrigerator. The shift from Icebox to electric refrigerator did not just change how people stored food. It changed how people thought about food. Suddenly, a week's worth of groceries could be purchased at once and stored safely. Meal planning became possible. The rhythm of domestic life, built for centuries around the necessity of daily fresh food procurement, fundamentally changed. Supermarkets, which required customers to buy more than daily necessities in a single shopping trip, became viable. The modern grocery industry, which depends entirely on consumers buying food in quantities that require refrigeration, would not exist without the home refrigerator. The medical history of ice is one of the least told but most consequential chapters in this story. Before anesthesia was fully developed and before antibiotics existed, cold was one of the few effective tools doctors had for managing pain, reducing fever, and preventing infection. Military surgeons used cold water and snow to numb limbs before amputation as far back as the Napoleonic Wars. The physician Dominique Jean-Larrey, Napoleon's chief surgeon, documented using snow and ice to reduce pain during battlefield amputations. In American hospitals of the 19th century, ice-packed bandages were used to reduce swelling and inflammation. Ice was applied to gunshot wounds to slow bleeding. Fever patients were packed in ice to bring their temperatures down, a technique that, while sometimes overused, did genuinely save lives in cases of extreme hyperthermia. During the American Civil War, the Union Army's Medical Corps specifically prioritized ice supply for field hospitals. Trains carrying wounded soldiers back from battlefronts also carried ice for medical use. The Confederate Army's inability to access ice in the later years of the war was considered a genuine military disadvantage, as Union hospitals could offer more effective treatment for fever and wound management. Beyond battlefield medicine, ice transformed the management of infectious disease. During yellow fever epidemics in New Orleans and other southern cities, ice was used to cool patients and reduce mortality. Public health officials recognized that reliable ice supply was a component of epidemic management. Cities without ice access during disease outbreaks had measurably higher death rates. The relationship between ice and medicine extended into the 20th century. The development of blood banking, the ability to store donated blood for transfusion, required refrigeration. The preservation of vaccines required cold storage. The transport of organs for transplantation requires cold chain logistics that trace their conceptual origins directly back to Frederic Tudor's insulated ice ships. Modern medicine's cold chain, the refrigerated storage and transport systems that keep vaccines effective from manufacturer to patient, is one of the most critical public health infrastructure systems on Earth. It currently saves millions of lives annually. And it is the direct descendant of techniques first developed by ice merchants in 19th century Boston. The impact of ice on food and daily life was not limited to the United States and Britain. As mechanical refrigeration spread globally through the late 19th and early 20th centuries, it reshaped food cultures around the world in ways that were both universal and uniquely local. In Japan, refrigeration enabled the modern sushi industry as it exists globally today. Traditional Edo period sushi was a fermented product, fish preserved through long lactofermentation, nothing like the fresh fish preparations that define sushi internationally today. The shift toward fresh fish sushi required cold storage and reliable refrigeration throughout the supply chain. Today's global sushi industry, which sells fresh raw fish in landlocked cities thousands of miles from any ocean, is entirely dependent on refrigerated transport, a cold chain that traces its origins to the same thermodynamic principles John Gorey applied in his Florida fever ward in 1844. In France, refrigeration transformed the cheese industry. While aged cheeses could survive without refrigeration, fresh cheeses, brie, camembert, fresh chèvre, required cold storage to reach markets in good condition. Refrigerated transport opened national and then international markets for cheeses that had previously been strictly local products. In India, refrigeration reshaped the dairy industry in ways that had enormous public health implications. The transition from unrefrigerated to refrigerated milk supply dramatically reduced milk-borne illness. The development of India's modern dairy cooperative system, one of the largest in the world, was built on cold chain infrastructure that allowed small farmers to supply chilled milk to collection points for centralized processing and distribution. In Brazil and across Latin America, refrigeration enabled the growth of the modern beef export industry. Cattle ranching in the interior of South America had always been constrained by the inability to transport fresh beef to coastal ports and international markets. Refrigerated ships, which first crossed the Atlantic with frozen beef in the 1870s and 1880s, opened global markets for South American beef and transformed the agricultural economies of Argentina, Uruguay, and Brazil. In virtually every culture and every economy, the arrival of reliable cold storage produced the same fundamental shift. Food moved from scarcity and seasonality toward abundance and year-round availability. Diets diversified. Nutrition improved. The link between geographic location and available food, which had defined human eating for all of recorded history, began to dissolve. The history of ice is not without its dark chapters. The industrial ice trade of the 19th century depended on a labor force of low-paid seasonal workers, mostly Irish and Italian immigrants in New England, who worked in brutal conditions. Ice harvesting in midwinter on frozen ponds was physically punishing, dangerous work. Workers who fell through thin ice drowned. Workers who handled ice constantly suffered chronic cold-related injuries. The seasonal nature of the work meant that ice harvesters had no income for half the year and lived in poverty the other half. The plantation-style labor practices of the ice trade in the American South were even more troubling. In Louisiana and Georgia, ice houses and early mechanical ice plants relied heavily on the labor of formerly enslaved black workers who had few other employment options after emancipation. The conditions in ice plants, extreme cold, heavy lifting, long hours, were genuinely dangerous, and worker protections were essentially non-existent. The environmental costs of industrial refrigeration, which expanded dramatically through the 20th century, have proven to be enormous. The refrigerants used in early mechanical refrigeration systems, sulfur dioxide, ammonia, methyl chloride, were toxic. When they were replaced in the 1930s with chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs, the new chemicals seemed like a technological triumph, safe, stable, and effective. It took decades to discover that CFCs were destroying the atmospheric ozone layer. The Montreal Protocol of 1987, which phased out CFC use globally, was one of the most significant environmental policy achievements in history, and it was necessitated entirely by the consequences of refrigeration chemistry. The modern refrigeration and air conditioning industry consumes approximately 17% of all electricity used globally. As refrigeration has spread to developing economies, a genuinely important development for food security and public health, the energy demands and associated carbon emissions have grown substantially. The cold chain that preserves food, saves lives, and connects global markets is also a significant contributor to the climate change that threatens the stability of all of those systems. This is the paradox at the heart of the ice story. The technology that solved enormous human problems has created new ones that are genuinely difficult to solve. Step back from the individual stories, the ice ships, the refrigerated railcars, the electric refrigerators, and look at what ice built in aggregate. The modern global food system, in its entirety, is built on cold. Approximately 40% of all food produced globally requires refrigeration at some point in its journey from farm to consumer. The global cold chain, the network of refrigerated storage facilities, refrigerated vehicles, and refrigerated retail environments that keeps food safe, is estimated to be worth over $300 billion annually. It employs tens of millions of people worldwide. Without cold chain infrastructure, food waste would be catastrophic. In developing regions where cold chain infrastructure is inadequate, up to 40% of food produced is lost to spoilage before it can be consumed. In developed regions where cold chain infrastructure is comprehensive, food loss rates are dramatically lower, still significant, but a fraction of what they would be without refrigeration. The global fresh produce industry, the year-round availability of fruits and vegetables from around the world in your local supermarket, is entirely dependent on refrigerated shipping containers. A strawberry grown in Chile in January can arrive fresh in a Chicago grocery store in February because of a cold chain that maintains precise temperature control for the entire 7,000-mile journey. The pharmaceutical industry depends on cold chain logistics for vaccine storage and distribution. The COVID-19 mRNA vaccines, which required storage at extraordinarily low temperatures of -70 degrees Celsius in some cases, pushed cold chain logistics to their technological limits and highlighted the critical importance of refrigeration infrastructure to global public health. None of this existed 200 years ago. All of it traces back to a 23-year-old man in Boston who watched a horse pull an ice plow across a frozen pond and decided that what he was looking at was not just water in a solid state but the future of global commerce. Today, ice is so ordinary that it has become invisible. You fill your glass at a dispenser in a refrigerator door. You add ice to your coffee, your soda, your water, without thinking about it. Restaurants bring ice water to your table automatically. Convenience stores sell bags of ice near the checkout for $1 or $2. Gas stations have ice machines humming 24 hours a day. The ice in your glass required no ships, no horses, no handsaws, no armies of workers on frozen ponds at dawn. It was made by a compressor running on electricity, in a machine built on thermodynamic principles first articulated by scientists who died before the technology they described ever reached commercial scale. But that ice connects you to something much larger. It connects you to the Persian engineers who built yachts in the desert with mortar made from egg whites. To Frederic Tudor being laughed out of every meeting room in Boston before rebuilding his fortune 3 times over. To the refrigerated ships that carried beef from Chicago to London and lobster from Maine to Paris and opened the world to the possibility that food did not have to be local or seasonal or scarce. It connects you to the doctors who packed yellow fever patients in ice in New Orleans. To the soldiers in World War I who received blood transfusions kept viable by refrigeration. To the billions of children who received vaccines that only worked because someone, somewhere, maintained the cold chain from manufacturer to clinic. The history of ice is the history of human beings refusing to accept the limitations that nature imposed on them. It is the history of the lengths people will go to for comfort, for health, for profit, and for the simple pleasure of a cold drink on a hot day. And that history is still being written. Researchers today are developing new refrigeration technologies that consume less energy and use refrigerants that do not damage the atmosphere. Engineers are designing solar-powered cold chain systems for rural communities in the developing world that currently lose enormous percentages of their food to spoilage. Scientists are working on vaccine formulations that do not require cold chain storage at all, potentially revolutionizing global health the way mechanical refrigeration revolutionized the food supply 150 years ago. Ice started as something that fell from the sky and was available only to those with the luck to live near mountains or the resources to import it at enormous cost. It became a commodity that nations fought to control, that merchants risked fortunes to move across oceans, and that engineers spent lifetimes trying to manufacture from thin air. Then it became infrastructure so fundamental that its absence would collapse the modern world. And then it became the ice in your glass. Something so ordinary you have never once thought about it. That is the full arc of ice. From wonder to weapon to workhorse to wallpaper. And now you know. If this story surprised you, hit subscribe. There are more stories like this one coming, histories of the ordinary things that built the extraordinary world you live in. You will want to be here for them.